Humanity measures itself by progress. We chart our advancement through the ages, from stone tools to smartphones, from cave paintings to quantum computers. Ancient humans discovered fire, invented the wheel, built civilizations, and slowly, carefully, passed their knowledge forward through the generations. Each era built upon the last, and progress moved in one direction, forward, always forward. But what happens when that story cracks? What happens when archaeologists unearth a hammer sealed inside rock that's older than humanity itself? When they find a Roman cup glowing with technology we only mastered in the 1990s? When perfectly cut stones rest in the mountains of Bolivia, carved with a precision our best engineers struggle to match even today? These objects exist. They sit in museums, in private collections, and in archaeological sites around the world. They're not theories or legends, they're physical, tangible, and undeniable. And yet, they refuse to fit into the timeline we've built for human history. Were ancient civilizations far more advanced than we've been taught? Did they possess knowledge that was somehow lost, erased by time or disaster? Or were they guided by forces we still don't understand? Hidden technologies, forgotten sciences, perhaps even something beyond this world? Before we begin, I want you to do two things. First, tell me where in the world you're watching from. It's incredible how mysteries like these connect people across continents and cultures. It's almost as if the past itself is calling us together. Second, make sure you subscribe now if you haven't, because once you see these artifacts, you won't want to miss the next discovery that shatters history as we know it. Today, we're going to examine 6 artifacts that challenge everything we think we know about human capability and the progression of history itself. 6 mysteries that remain, to this day, completely unexplained. In the year 1936, a couple was walking along a riverbank near the small town of London, Texas, enjoying the quiet afternoon. The landscape was unremarkable: scrubby brush, weathered stones, the kind of terrain you'd pass without a second glance. But then, something caught their eye. Jutting out from a lump of rock is what appears to be a piece of wood, darkened with age, and partially embedded in the stone itself. They picked it up, but the rock is heavy, solid, and ancient-looking. And trapped inside it, like an insect preserved in amber, was a hammer. Not just any hammer. The wooden handle was partially fossilized and had turned to stone over countless years. The iron head was still intact, sealed inside the rock formation as if nature itself had built a vault around it. It looked like it was swallowed whole by the earth and then spat back out millions of years later. When geologists first examined the stone surrounding the hammer, some made a startling claim. The rock formation, they said, could be over 100 million years old, dating back to the Cretaceous period, the age of dinosaurs. If true, that would place this hammer in a time when the only creatures walking the earth were reptiles with scales and teeth, long before the first mammals, long before the first primates, and impossibly, long before the first humans. But here's where the mystery deepens. The hammer itself doesn't look ancient at all. When metallurgists analyzed the iron head, they found something extraordinary. It's composed of 96.6% pure iron, a level of purity that exceeds most ironwork from the 19th century. Modern blacksmiths of that era typically produced iron with far more impurities, carbon content, and slag mixed into the metal. This hammer's iron is cleaner, purer, and more refined than it has any right to be. And then there's the preservation. Iron rusts. It oxidizes when exposed to air and moisture, flaking away into reddish-brown powder over time. Any tool left in the elements for even a few decades shows significant corrosion. But this hammer, allegedly sealed in rock for millions of years, shows minimal oxidation. The metal has remained remarkably intact, as if it were forged yesterday and then somehow transported backward through time. The implications are staggering. If the geological dating is accurate, this hammer existed tens of millions of years before humans were supposed to walk the earth. Before Homo sapiens, before Neanderthals, before any hominid species ever picked up a stone tool. It would mean that intelligent beings capable of metallurgy were working with refined iron while dinosaurs still roamed the planet. Of course, skeptics have offered explanations. The most common is concretion. which is a geological process where minerals in groundwater can harden rapidly around objects, forming rock-like shells in a matter of decades rather than millions of years. In this view, the hammer is simply a modern tool, perhaps lost by a 19th or early 20th century miner or settler, and the surrounding rock formed around it relatively recently through natural mineral deposits. It's a reasonable explanation. Concretion does happen, and it can create formations that look ancient when they're not. But questions remain. Why was the hammer found in such a remote location, far from any known mines or industrial sites? If it were a common tool from a century ago, why the unusual purity of the iron? And how do we explain the preservation, the lack of rust, the way the metal has remained so intact despite being encased in rock? Some researchers suggest the hammer is evidence of a lost civilization, one that existed long before recorded history, one that possessed metallurgical knowledge we've only recently rediscovered. Others whisper about time anomalies, objects somehow displaced from their proper era, slipping through cracks in the fabric of time itself. Still others propose geological processes we don't yet understand, forces of nature that can preserve and seal objects in ways that defy our current scientific models. The London hammer remains locked away today in a private collection, unavailable for modern testing with advanced equipment that might finally settle the debate. And so it sits, a simple tool that refuses to fit into any timeline we understand, a riddle wrapped in stone, waiting for an answer that may never come. Most people will hear about these mysteries and then move on, forgetting them as if they don't matter. Don't be one of them. Hit subscribe right now, or you'll lose your chance to uncover truths that others will bury and forget forever. Deep in the deserts of southern Iraq lies the ancient site of Tel al-Ubaid, a place where human civilization first began to take shape. This is Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, the cradle where agriculture, writing, and organized society were born. In the early 20th century, archaeologists excavating this site uncovered something from the very dawn of human culture. Small statues, buried beneath layers of sand and time, dated back nearly 7,000 years to a period between 5900 and 4000 BCE. They belong to the Ubaid culture, one of the earliest known societies in human history, a people who lived before the Sumerians, before the invention of writing, and before the great ziggurats rose from the desert floor. At first glance, the figurines appear to be ordinary, simple clay sculptures depicting human forms, the kind of religious or ceremonial objects found at countless archaeological sites around the world. But as the dust is carefully brushed away and the details emerge, something deeply unsettling becomes clear. These figures don't look entirely human. The bodies are humanoid, with 2 arms, 2 legs, shoulders, and a torso shaped like ours. But the heads are elongated, reptilian, and alien. The skulls taper to points, stretching upward in a way no human skull ever could. The eyes are large, almond-shaped, and slanted at sharp angles with no visible pupils, just blank staring surfaces. The faces have a scaled texture, rough and segmented like the skin of a lizard or a snake. Some of the statues show exaggerated shoulder width, proportions that seem deliberately distorted. Others depict females holding infants with the same elongated skulls and the same reptilian features, as if this wasn't just the appearance of adults, but of an entire species. The figures are shown in ritualistic poses, positions that suggest ceremony, worship, or practices whose meaning has been lost to time. The craftsmanship is advanced for such an early period. The modeling techniques show skill and intention, and they show that these aren't crude carvings or abstract representations. They're detailed, deliberate, and carved with care by people who knew exactly what they were depicting. But here's the problem. The Ubaid people left no written records, no clay tablets, no inscriptions, no stories carved into stone to explain who or what these beings were. They existed before writing was invented and before human beings found a way to preserve their thoughts beyond the spoken word. And so the statues stand alone as silent witnesses to something we can no longer understand. Were these gods worshipped by the Ubaid people? Were they deities from their religious beliefs or entities they prayed to for protection, for harvests, and for fertility? That's the mainstream archaeological explanation. These are stylized representations of divine beings, symbolic rather than literal, exaggerated for ceremonial purposes. But then, why this specific imagery? Why reptilian features? Why elongated skulls and unblinking eyes? Some researchers have suggested they might represent actual visitors, beings that the Ubaid people encountered, entities not of this earth, preserved in clay by a culture trying to record what they saw. Others propose they reflect a cultural memory, a deep ancestral recollection of serpent-like creatures that haunted the myths of early humanity, figures that would later appear in the legends of many civilizations, the serpent in the Garden of Eden, the dragon gods of Asia, and the feathered serpent of Mesoamerica. There are even theories that these statues depict shamanic transformation, spiritual leaders who believed they could take on the forms of animals or otherworldly beings during ritual trances, or that they represent a now extinct subspecies of human, a branch of our evolutionary tree that once existed alongside Homo sapiens and then vanished, leaving only these strange images behind. Mainstream archaeology dismisses most of these ideas. The figures they insist are simply art, religious iconography and nothing more. Ancient people often created exaggerated, symbolic depictions of their gods, and these statues fit that pattern. But the truth is, no one knows for certain. We can't know. The Ubaid people are gone, their language unspoken for millennia, and their beliefs and stories have been erased by time. All we have are these statues, staring out from museum display cases with their blank reptilian eyes. What makes them so chilling is their age. These figures come from the very beginning of civilization, from a time when humans were just learning to farm, just beginning to build permanent settlements, just starting to shape the world around them. And at that precise moment, at the threshold of recorded history, they chose to create images of beings that look nothing like us. The Ubaid statues remain one of archaeology's most unsettling mysteries, not because of what they show, but because of what they refuse to tell us. They're guardians of a secret from the dawn of human society, a mystery that may be older than history itself. Every time we ignore mysteries like this, they fade deeper into the shadows of history. That's how civilizations are forgotten. Subscribe now so you never lose sight of the past. And if you refuse, go ahead and type in the comments why you're comfortable letting human history disappear. Rome, 4th century AD. The empire was at its height, stretching from Britain to North Africa, from Spain to the Middle East. Roman engineers were building aqueducts, roads and monuments that would stand for thousands of years, and their glassmakers were creating beautiful vessels, intricate designs, and works of art that displayed the skill and sophistication of their craft. Among these creations was a cup, ornate and elaborate, carved from a single piece of glass. It depicted a scene from Greek mythology, King Lycurgus, tangled in vines, punished by the god Dionysus for his arrogance. The cup was a diatretum, a cage cup, with delicate openwork carving that made the glass look like lace frozen in time. It was beautiful, it was impressive, but it was also, in every sense of the word, impossible. The Lycurgus cup, now housed in the British Museum, possessed a property that defied explanation. When light shone on it from the outside, the glass appeared jade green, a deep, rich color that seemed solid and opaque. But when light was placed inside the cup, when illumination passed through the glass from within, the entire object transformed. It glowed blood red, a luminous otherworldly crimson that seemed to pulse with inner fire. The cup changed color depending on the position of the light source. It was dichroic, a term that means two colors, and it did this through a mechanism that shouldn't have existed in the ancient world. In the 1990s, scientists at the British Museum decided to examine the cup more closely. They used electron microscopes, tools capable of seeing objects at the atomic level, and what they discovered left them stunned. Embedded in the glass, scattered throughout its structure, were nanoparticles, tiny fragments of gold and silver, each measuring approximately 50 nanometers in diameter. To put that in perspective, a single nanometer is 1/1000th of a meter. These particles were roughly 1,000th the width of a human hair, far too small to see with the naked eye or even with standard microscopes. These nanoparticles were what created the color-changing effect. When light hit them, they interacted with the wavelengths in a specific way, absorbing some colors and reflecting others depending on the angle and position of the light. It was a phenomenon called surface plasmon resonance, a principle of quantum physics that governs how light behaves at the nanoscale. This was nanotechnology, the manipulation of matter at the atomic level, precise control over particles so small that they exist in the realm of quantum mechanics. And the Romans had made it in the 4th century AD. Here was the problem. Nanotechnology as a field of science wasn't officially invented until the 1980s. The first modern dichroic glass using nanoparticles was created in the 1990s by scientists working with electron microscopes, advanced physics, and decades of research into material science. To achieve the effect seen in the Lycurgus cup required not just embedding gold and silver particles in glass, it required getting the ratio exactly right, the size precisely calibrated, the distribution perfectly even. Too many particles and the glass turned opaque. Too few and there was no color change. The margin of error was infinitesimal. For this to happen by accident, as some had suggested, would have been statistically impossible. It would have been like randomly throwing chemicals together and accidentally creating a working computer chip. And yet, the Romans had done it. Once. That was another mystery. Only one complete Lycurgus cup existed. Fragments of one other similar cup had been found, but no others. The Romans, a civilization that mass-produced pottery, glass, and countless other goods, had apparently made this cup and then never replicated it. There were no Roman texts describing the manufacturing process, no recipes, no instructions, no records of experimentation or failed attempts. It was as if someone had created a miracle in glass and then the knowledge had vanished, erased from history as completely as if it had never existed. Had the Romans stumbled upon this effect by pure chance, creating something even they didn't fully understand? Or had they possessed knowledge of light, of particle physics, of material science that we've only recently rediscovered? Some researchers have speculated that this might have been inherited knowledge, wisdom passed down from an even earlier source, perhaps from the Greeks, perhaps from civilizations we've lost entirely. The question remained, why didn't the technology spread? Why didn't Roman glassmakers perfect this technique, refine it, turn it into an industry? The Romans were masterful engineers, practical people who saw a useful innovation and exploited it to its fullest. And yet, this extraordinary discovery appeared once in their history and then disappeared. Today, scientists study the Lycurgus cup to understand ancient manufacturing techniques. The principles behind its dichroic properties are now used in modern applications: pregnancy tests that change color, biosensors that detect diseases, medical diagnostics, and even potential future technologies in data storage and optical computing. The cup sits in its display case in the British Museum, glowing green or red depending on where the light falls, a Roman artifact that required 20th century technology just to understand what it was. It's proof that knowledge can be discovered, lost, and rediscovered across vast stretches of time, that human ingenuity can sometimes leap forward into territory we won't reach again for centuries. A simple cup, impossible and beautiful, waiting patiently for us to finally catch up to what the Romans knew when 700 years ago. Imagine knowing discoveries like this exist and doing nothing. That's what refusing to subscribe means. You turn your back on mysteries that could change the way humanity understands itself. If that doesn't scare you, it should. Across the former territories of the Roman Empire, scattered through modern-day France, Britain, Germany, and beyond, archaeologists made a peculiar discovery. Again and again, in different locations and different contexts, they unearthed the same mysterious object. It was roughly the size of a human fist, made of bronze or sometimes stone, and hollow inside. It had 12 flat faces, each one a pentagon. On every face was a circular hole, and here was the strange part. Each hole was a different size, ranging from small perforations to openings large enough to fit a finger through. At each corner where the faces met, there was a small knob or sphere protruding outward, giving the object a spiky, almost alien appearance. They were called Roman dodecahedra, and over 130 of them had been found so far. They dated to the 2nd through 4th centuries AD, during the height of Roman power, and they had been discovered in military camps, in civilian homes, buried in hoards of valuable objects and hidden in fields and forests. And no one had any idea what they were used for. That might not have seemed strange at first, since ancient artifacts were often mysterious and their purposes lost to time. But the Romans weren't a secretive people. They were obsessive record keepers who documented everything from military campaigns to household inventories, from architectural plans to recipes for fish sauce. Roman literature was extensive, filled with descriptions of daily life, tools, religious practices, games, and customs. And yet, nowhere in all of Roman writing was there a single mention of these dodecahedra. Not one reference, not in letters, not in official documents, not in histories or poetry or plays. They didn't appear in Roman art, in mosaics or frescoes, or in sculptures, and they were absent from military lists, from temple inventories, and from merchant records. This silence was unprecedented. The Romans catalogued mundane objects, pottery shards, simple tools, common household items. They wrote about trivial things, everyday occurrences, and the minutiae of life. So why would they completely ignore an object that was clearly widespread, clearly valuable enough to be made from bronze, and clearly important enough to be buried and preserved? The implication was unsettling. Either these objects were so common, so ordinary, that the Romans didn't think they were worth mentioning, which seemed unlikely given their craftsmanship and material cost, or they were so secret, so restricted, that no one dared write about them. Over the years, researchers proposed dozens of theories about what Roman dodecahedra might have been used for. Some said they were surveying instruments, tools for measuring distances or angles. The holes of different sizes could theoretically align with markers or help calculate measurements. But if that was true, why the knobs at every corner? They would have made the object unstable, difficult to place on flat ground, and impractical for precise work. Others suggested they were astronomical devices, perhaps calendars or tools for tracking the movement of stars. But there were no markings, no numbers, no inscriptions to indicate dates or celestial positions, which raised the question of how one would use a calendar with no labels. Could they have been military rangefinders, devices to help determine the distance to enemy forces? Possibly, but the dodecahedra were often too decorative, too elaborate for battlefield use, and they were found in civilian homes in places far from military camps, which didn't fit a weapons-related function. Maybe they were candle holders. The knobs could steady the candle while the holes allowed light to shine through, but it was an inefficient design for that purpose. Candles would burn unevenly, wax would drip inside the hollow interior, and there were far simpler ways to hold a flame. Religious or ritual objects. Perhaps they were used in ceremonies, divination, or spiritual practices that were no longer understood. But if so, why weren't they found in temples? And why was there no association with other religious artifacts? Here was the frustrating truth. Every theory had fatal flaws, and every explanation left unanswered questions. If they were utilitarian tools, why was there such variation in the size of the holes from one dodecahedron to another? Some had tiny perforations, while others had gaping openings, suggesting they were customized for different purposes or users. If they were ceremonial, why was there no connection to temples or religious sites? And if they were military, why were they found in the homes of civilians, in places with no strategic importance? The variation in hole diameter was particularly puzzling because it suggested specificity and intentionality, as if each dodecahedron was made for a particular task or person. But what task required 12 different-sized holes on a bronze polyhedron? The Roman dodecahedra sat in museums today, lined up in display cases, dozens of identical mysteries staring back at visitors. They were real, tangible, and crafted with skill and care. The Romans who made them knew exactly what they were for, knew it so well they didn't bother writing it down. And now, 2,000 years later, we didn't. It was one of archaeology's most humbling mysteries, not an object from a lost civilization or a forgotten culture, but something from the Romans, one of the best documented societies in human history. They left us libraries of information and detailed accounts of their world, and yet they left us this: a geometric puzzle with no solution, a tool with no name, and an object whose very purpose had vanished completely from human memory. Perhaps that was the most frightening thing about the Roman Dodecahedra. They were proof that entire categories of knowledge could disappear, that something could be common, widespread and important, and then simply be forgotten, erased so thoroughly that future generations could only guess at what it once meant. The dodecahedra remained silent and enigmatic, a reminder that even in the most well-documented eras of history, there were secrets we would never recover. Don't let skeptics and gatekeepers erase mysteries like this. Hit subscribe if you believe history's secrets deserve to be uncovered. Silence only protects the liars. High in the Bolivian Altiplano, 12,800 feet above sea level, the air was thin and cold. The wind swept across barren plains, and the landscape stretched out in shades of brown and grey, harsh and unforgiving. This was not a place where one would expect to find one of the world's greatest architectural achievements. And yet, scattered across this desolate plateau were massive stone blocks, some weighing over 100 tons, carved with a precision that seemed impossible and arranged in patterns that defied explanation. This was Puma Punku, and it shouldn't have existed. The site was part of a larger complex near Tiwanaku, an ancient city that thrived in the Andes. Traditional dating placed the construction somewhere between 600 and 1000 AD, though some researchers argued it could be far older. What was undisputed was the sheer scale and sophistication of the stonework, work that challenged everything we thought we knew about ancient engineering. The blocks at Puma Punku were not roughly hewn or crudely shaped. They were cut with flat surfaces so precise that they were accurate to within 1/100th of an inch. To put that in perspective, modern machinists considered something flat if it was within a few thousandths of an inch, and these ancient stones matched that standard across surfaces spanning several feet. The angles were perfect, 90-degree corners that could have been drawn with a protractor, and edges so straight they might have been laser cut. And then there were the interlocking joints, H-shaped blocks with grooves carved into them so precisely that they fit together without mortar, without gaps, like pieces of a giant stone puzzle. If you ran your hand across these surfaces, they felt smooth, almost polished, as if they had been machined rather than carved. There was no roughness, no tool marks, and no indication of how this level of precision was achieved. And here was where the mystery deepened. These blocks were made from andesite and diorite, some of the hardest stones on Earth. On the Mohs scale of mineral hardness, which ranged from 1, talc, which you could scratch with a fingernail, to 10, diamond, the hardest natural substance. Andesite and diorite ranked between 7 and 8. For comparison, steel was about 6.5, which meant these stones were harder than the metal we use to make cutting tools. Today, when we need to cut stones this hard, we use diamond-tipped saws, industrial equipment powered by electricity, cooled with water, and operated by trained workers. Even with modern technology, cutting and shaping diorite was difficult, time-consuming, and expensive. The ancient Andean people didn't have steel. They didn't have iron. The hardest metal available to them was copper, which ranked about 3 on the Mohs scale. You couldn't cut diorite with copper. You couldn't even scratch it. It would be like trying to carve granite with a butter knife. So how did they do it? How were these massive blocks transported from quarries that were miles away, across terrain with no roads, in a culture that didn't use the wheel for transportation? How were 100-ton stones lifted and positioned with such exactitude that their surfaces aligned to within fractions of an inch? And how were the intricate grooves carved, the smooth faces created, and the perfect angles achieved? There were no tool marks on the stones, no evidence of mistakes, no practice blocks showing a learning curve, and no failed attempts scattered around the site. The precision appeared suddenly in the archaeological record, as if the builders went from working with crude stone tools to creating masterpieces overnight, with no period of gradual development in between. Modern stonemasons who visited Puma Punku were baffled. Some admitted they couldn't replicate this work even with contemporary equipment. The level of skill required, the understanding of geometry and engineering, and the sheer physical capability to move and shape these stones. It all pointed to a level of technological sophistication that didn't match our understanding of ancient Andean culture. So researchers proposed theories, some conventional and others far more speculative. Perhaps the Tiwanaku people possessed advanced tools that had since been lost, advanced cutting implements made from materials that had disintegrated over time, or techniques involving abrasives and patience that we hadn't fully reconstructed. Some suggested acoustic levitation, the use of sound waves to move massive objects, a concept that existed in modern physics but seemed fantastical in an ancient context. Others proposed an unknown stone softening technique, a method of temporarily making the rock malleable and allowing it to be molded like clay before hardening again. There were legends among indigenous Andean people of plants that could soften stone, though no such plant had ever been identified. Then there were theories about ancient machinery, cranes, pulley systems, and devices whose evidence had been erased by centuries of weathering, or perhaps deliberately hidden or destroyed. And at the far edge of speculation, there were those who suggested extraterrestrial assistance. That the precision at Puma Punku represented capabilities beyond human reach and proof of visitors from beyond our world who shared their knowledge with ancient people. The mainstream archaeological community dismissed most of these ideas, insisting that the stones were carved using patience, primitive tools, and sheer determination over many years. But that explanation struggled to account for the precision, the lack of errors, and the sudden appearance of this technology without a visible developmental period. And then there were the additional anomalies. The site appeared unfinished, as if construction had been abruptly abandoned midway through. Some blocks showed signs of damage from extreme heat, temperatures high enough to melt stone, though no one knew what could have caused such heat in an era before modern furnaces. The interlocking system suggested modular construction, pieces designed to fit together in specific ways, like ancient Lego blocks, hinting at an advanced understanding of engineering principles. There were also water channels carved into the stone with the same impossible precision, and the entire site was aligned with astronomical phenomena, positioned to mark solstices and equinoxes with exactitude. The question that haunted Puma Punku wasn't just, how did they do it? It was, what knowledge was lost? These stones represented a peak of technological achievement, a moment when ancient people accomplished something extraordinary. And then, for reasons we didn't understand, that knowledge disappeared. The techniques were forgotten, the tools were lost, and the understanding of how to work stone with such precision vanished from human memory. Modern engineering could achieve similar results, yes, but only with advanced machinery, computer-aided design, diamond-tipped tools, cranes, and electricity. Ancient people, without any of those things, without even the wheel for transport, without steel or written mathematics, accomplished the same feat. Puma Punku stood on its windswept plateau, a monument to human potential that we still couldn't fully explain. It was either evidence of capabilities we had underestimated in ancient cultures, or proof that history had forgotten entire chapters of human achievement, chapters that might force us to completely rewrite our understanding of the past. The stones remained, scattered and silent, carved with impossible precision, and waiting for us to finally understand how they came to be. Egypt, 1898. Archaeologists were excavating the Saqqura necropolis, an ancient burial ground near Cairo, a place where Egyptians had been laying their dead to rest for thousands of years. Among the tombs and sand, they entered the burial chamber of a man named Padi Imen, dated to approximately 200 BCE, the Ptolemaic period, when Greek dynasties ruled over the land of the pharaohs. Inside the tomb, among the usual funerary offerings, pottery, jewelry, and amulets meant to protect the deceased in the afterlife, they found a small object carved from sycamore wood. It was light, weighing just 39 grams, about an ounce and a half. At first glance, it looked like a bird, a simple carving, the kind of thing Egyptians made for centuries to represent the soul or as toys for children. It was catalogued as a wooden bird model and placed in storage at the Cairo Museum alongside thousands of other artifacts. And there it sat, forgotten, for over 70 years. Then, in 1969, a man named Dr. Khalil Messiha, a physician with a background in Egyptology and a fascination with aviation, was reviewing items in the museum's collection. He came across the small wooden bird and paused, because something about it caught his attention. It didn't look like other Egyptian bird carvings. The object was 14.2 centimeters long, about 5-6 inches, with a wingspan of 18.3 centimeters, roughly 7.2 inches. But it had no feather markings and no decorative details that typically adorned Egyptian representations of birds. The body was smooth, streamlined, and aerodynamically efficient. The wings were angled slightly downward in what was called a dihedral configuration, a design feature used in modern aircraft to provide stability during flight. And then there was the tail. Instead of a bird's tail with spreading feathers and natural curves, the Saqqura bird had a vertical tail fin, flat, straight, and standing upright like the rudder of an airplane. It looked more like a fish's tail than a bird's, but it was positioned exactly where you would place a vertical stabilizer on a glider. Dr. Messiha recognized these features. He was familiar with aeronautical engineering principles, and what he was looking at wasn't a simple bird carving. It was a shape that mimicked the design of a modern glider. A flying machine optimized for soaring through the air with minimal effort, using air currents and subtle control surfaces to stay aloft. The wing-to-fuselage ratio matched that of gliders. The dihedral angle of the wings provided lateral stability, preventing the craft from rolling to one side. The smooth body minimized drag, reducing air resistance, and even the weight distribution seemed intentional, with the center of gravity positioned to balance the craft in flight. If this were a bird, you would expect features that made it recognizable, details that honored the sacred animals Egyptians revered, like the falcon for Horus or the ibis for Thoth. But there were none. This object looked functional, not decorative, and it looked like it was designed to fly. Word of Dr. Messiha's discovery spread, and researchers began building replicas of the Saqqura bird. When launched, some of these models achieved gliding flight. They soared smoothly through the air using the same principles that governed modern gliders. Other researchers added a horizontal stabilizer to the tail, a small fin extending backward, and the flight improved dramatically. The craft became even more stable, capable of longer glides and more controlled flight. This suggested the original Saqqura bird may have had a missing piece, a horizontal tail section that deteriorated over the centuries, leaving only the vertical fin behind. Wood was an organic material. It rotted and it crumbled, especially over 2 millennia. If the bird once had a complete tail assembly, time could have claimed it, leaving us with only a partial artifact. But if that was true, if this object was indeed a functional glider or a model of one, then the implications were staggering. The ancient Egyptians would have understood aerodynamics. They would have grasped principles of lift, drag, stability, and control surfaces, concepts that wouldn't be formally studied in Europe until the Renaissance, and wouldn't be fully understood until the Wright brothers' experiments in the early 20th century. Were these objects toys, simple playthings carved for children? Possibly, but the aerodynamic efficiency seemed too precise, too deliberate for a random toy design. Could they be scale models of actual flying machines, gliders that ancient Egyptians built and flew, using the Nile winds and thermal currents to soar above the desert? There was no direct evidence of full-sized gliders in the archaeological record, no depictions in tomb paintings, and no hieroglyphic texts describing human flight. But absence of evidence wasn't evidence of absence. Papyrus decayed, wood rotted, and much of what the Egyptians knew had been lost. Or perhaps the Saqqura bird was a religious symbol, a representation of the soul's journey, the BA that the Egyptians believed could fly between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. But if so, Why the precise aerodynamic form? And why not make it look more like an actual bird? Skeptics argued that the features were coincidental, that the ancient Egyptians carved a bird and accidentally created something that resembled a glider. They had no context for aviation and no understanding of flight beyond watching birds and insects, so any aerodynamic properties were just a lucky chance. And yet, when you held a replica of the Saqqura bird, when you felt its balance, and when you launched it and watched it glide smoothly through the air, coincidence started to feel like an insufficient explanation. There were similar artifacts from other parts of the ancient world. In Colombia, gold objects from the Quimbaya culture resembled modern jet aircraft, delta wings, vertical stabilizers, and cockpit-like structures. They were often dismissed as stylized insects or birds, but their shapes were eerily reminiscent of aeronautical designs. This created a pattern. Multiple ancient cultures, separated by thousands of miles and centuries, were creating objects that looked suspiciously aerodynamic. Either it was a remarkable coincidence, or there was something about human curiosity and experimentation that led ancient people to explore the principles of flight in ways we had forgotten or never recorded. The Saqqura bird sat in the Cairo Museum today, a small wooden object in a glass case, labeled and catalogued, but still mysterious. Visitors walked past it, many unaware of the debate it had sparked and the questions it raised about what ancient people knew and what they were capable of. Why would ancient Egyptians, living over 2,000 years ago, create something that perfectly mimicked the design of a modern glider? If it were purely decorative, why incorporate functional aerodynamic principles? And if birds were the inspiration, why strip away all the features that made a bird recognizable? The feathers, the curved tail, and the details that every other Egyptian bird carving possessed? Did ancient people experiment with flight in ways that history had forgotten? Did they build gliders, test them, refine their designs, and then lose that knowledge when empires fell and libraries burned? Or was the Saqqura bird simply what skeptics claimed, a toy, a trinket, and a lucky accident that happened to look like something it was never meant to be? The wood was real, the measurements were precise, the aerodynamic properties were undeniable, and the questions remained unanswered, hanging in the air like the bird itself might have once done, soaring on winds over the Nile, a small wooden mystery that forced us to ask what the ancients knew about the sky that we had spent millennia trying to relearn. A small wooden bird, carved by hands that had been dust for over 2,000 years, was still gliding through history, still refusing to land, and still challenging us to look up and wonder what else we had forgotten about the past. What knowledge did we lose? What did ancient people understand that we're only now rediscovering? Were they more advanced than we believe, or were they guided by something we can't yet comprehend? These artifacts don't provide answers. They only deepen the questions. And maybe that's exactly what they're meant to do.